Welcome, Karen. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're very excited to have you. And I'm particularly excited because about, I'm going to say 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, I can't remember quite now, I asked some of my writers who they would most like to see me interview. And you came up, your name came up first, and your name got seconded like time and time again. And I thought,
So
well,
nice to hear.
then I thought, well, what a big ask. How am I gonna make that happen? And very nicely and serendipitously for me, Carol Stivers is one of our group, and she pinged on and said, "Oh, actually, I know Karen. Would you like me to introduce you?" And I thought that would be lovely, but why would Karen ever say yes? And then you said yes, so I'm so happy to be here. And I'm especially happy because I'll confess that I knew your name, but in kind of like out of my foggy world here, I thought of you primarily as a science fiction writer. And just like some of your characters in your Jane Austen book club book, I immediately kind of assumed that your writing wasn't particularly for me because I think that I don't read science fiction, but once I started reading your Jane Austen book and thinking about it, I actually read more of it than I think. Um, and so it's just been a delight, I have to say personally, just such a delight to discover your work in these last 6 weeks. I've been having a great time with all these novels, and I have lots of questions to ask you about them. Um, but so I don't hog all the questions and be selfish with this interview, let's start with just like laying the foundation and sharing your journey with all these writers here who are interested in writers' journeys. So, first of all, right from the beginning, go back to the beginning. At what point did you realize that you actually like to write?
I think like many writers, I started writing when I was quite young. I wrote my first book when I was about 5. It was a collection of short stories. My parents were incredibly excited uh, by this, pretty ordinary uh, product that I had created, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. And I think that I continued to want to be a writer for a number of years, maybe until I hit adolescence. And then for reasons I don't remember and can't really explain, I just sort of lost track of that ambition. I think in retrospect, maybe my parents made too much of it. And I sort of felt that, um, whatever pleasures and whatever admiration writing might bring me, I'd already had it. So there was no point in continuing. And I came back to it at age 30, literally on my 30th birthday, in a sort of embarrassing crisis of feeling old and feeling that I had not yet figured out who I wanted to be. I remembered that who I actually wanted to be was a writer.
And so what did you do? Like you picked up the pen and so it sounds like you started with short stories even when you were 5. Is that where you went next then, to short stories?
I started actually with poetry. I attended the Napa Writers Poetry Conference, and I also joined in Davis, California, where I was living at the time. I joined a public workshop that was just open to anybody, and there
Hmm.
were about 7 or 8 other people in it. We met once a week. We brought in whatever we had managed to write in the previous week. We made copies to pass out.
Hmm.
We read our work aloud as people followed along on the copies, which reading your work aloud, if you're just beginning, is a pretty terrifying trial by fire.
Hmm.
But I stayed in that writing group the entire time that I lived in Davis, which was another 30 plus years.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. So you were in your writers group for over 30 years?
Yes. people came and went. There was a very
Mhm.
solid core that had been there as long as I had, or almost as long, or even a little bit longer. But other people came and left and came and left and came and left. And
Right.
um,
Right. That's so interesting because I remember that in the Jane Austen book club, there's like a little mention there about writers groups, and I thought I wasn't quite sure how to take it, whether 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 the author, well, the narrator definitely might be a little bit ambivalent about the both the quality and the usefulness of writers groups, but by your 30-year stint, it sounds like you're a big believer in them.
well, yeah, to be honest, I don't remember mentioning writers groups in the Jane Austen book club at all. It was a very long time ago, but I guess I do have some ambivalent feelings about them
Mhm.
because I think they can go horribly wrong.
Right.
But I also think, that whatever it is, I now think I know, I learned in that writing workshop primarily. And so I think they're very valuable. I just think you have to be kind of careful with
Mhm.
them. I
Mm.
think you get a lot of advice from people who are smart and who love you and want your work to succeed and think they see what you've done wrong. And, and it's for all of that, for all of their brilliance and their best intentions, it's still very bad advice. And it's very hard for the writer to distinguish between good advice and bad advice, and you get a lot of both. So
Right.
you have to kind of be obstinate, I think, to have a writers group really work for you.
That's great. And when we've discussed a couple of your novels, I want to come back to this point because I have something to ask you about that. But okay, so we don't get too bogged down right in the first 5 minutes. So you were part of this writers group. You started writing poetry. When did you then move from poetry to short story? And what half a step back, that writers group that you stayed in for 30 years was, did they only do poetry?
No, they did anything, nonfiction, fiction, whatever. Like I
Hmm.
said, it was probably topped out some periods at maybe 10 people at most. Mostly it was like 7 or 8. So,
Hmm.
there was no reason to restrict ourselves.
Right. No, that's
And
great. So
I really do feel strongly that whatever genre you are working in, you can get nothing but good from looking at other types of writing, all
mhm,
types of writing.
right.
One of the things that I say to students often when I'm teaching is that I want them to go into the library and pull off the shelves a book that does not interest them in any way and take it home and read it.
Uh-huh. Ah, that's a great piece of advice. And I absolutely believe that, good writing is good writing, and you can learn from it wherever you encounter it. So how did you then get moved from poetry into whatever you were writing next?
I had I liked writing poetry. I loved writing poetry, but I had, I think, a very old-fashioned idea of what poetry was. I grew up listening to my father read the kind of poetry that rhymes and declaims, and I love that kind of poetry. And of course, that kind of poetry is not at all what people wanted. Um, and I think I got to a point where I felt I felt that I could be a good poet, but I felt that I would never be a great poet. And for some reason, it seemed less shameful to not be a great short story writer than to not be a great poet.
I totally understand that. There's this wonderful quote somewhere that I've lost hands, like I can't find it anymore. But I came across it that said it was some little phrase that said that when the poet walks by, like the novelist has to step back, or something like that. And I really, it seems to me also that that yes, the most shameful thing would be to be a bad poet. I don't even think about not being a great poet. I'm just like a bad poet. So, you know, I like I write short fiction, children's books and short stories. I have been working on a novel for way too long, but and I think that I can make a decent hash at both of those things, but my poetry is just spectacularly bad. So, so anyway, so you decided that it was less shameful to be a not a great short story writer, so you
Right,
went in that direction.
right.
And did you? So you were saying about learning across genres, but did you naturally find yourself gravitating to? I mean, obviously, a lot of your name has been made in science fiction. So is that where you went first, or is that just where you kind of landed after a meander?
I think I make too much of this in my personal mythology, but I grew up the first 11 years of my life I spent in Bloomington, Indiana. And my parents and I went to the library every Friday. My whole family went to the library every Friday. And the children's room in Bloomington did not identify books by genre at all. And so it was, you know, I might pull anything off the shelf. And the idea that there were genres honestly just didn't cross my mind. You know, there was no point at which I thought, oh, I'm reading this kind of book. When we moved to Palo Alto, and the children's library did sort books that way, so that, you know, there was an icon on the spine and you would know it was a boot, and so the book was a Western, or it was a rocket ship, and so the book was science fiction. But by then I was already set in my ways, and I just had no interest in those kinds of distinctions. And you know, it informed in no way what book I might pull off the shelf. So when I started writing, because I had always read anything and everything, it made sense to write anything and everything. And what happened was that the sort of the bar for first publications is a little lower in science fiction, because the magazines take so many more stories than the literary magazines tend to take.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
so, you know, although I was submitting everywhere, the only things that sold were the science fiction short stories. So
mm-hmm,
suddenly I was a science fiction writer, and the implications of that were very unclear to me. But uh, you know, I love science fiction, so
mm-hmm.
I was in no way disturbed.
Since then, have you ever found it frustrating? Do you ever feel like you get pigeonholed? I mean, your work, for someone that I kind of vaguely thought was a science fiction writer, to me doesn't read very science fiction at all. And I actually laughed because there was a quote that I came across where you said that you wanted Sarah Canary to be read by science fiction readers as science fiction and by mainstream readers as mainstream. And I thought, oh, I should tell Karen that you were completely successful, because I'm a historical fiction author, and I came to it and I was like, whoa, this is historical fiction. It didn't occur to me it was anything else. And then I read a book review that mentioned how Sarah Canary was an alien. I was completely astounded by that conclusion, because that's not where I went with that book at all. And I enjoyed it so immensely. So do you ever get frustrated at people trying to put you into, and I'm sure in every writing career, the more that you do, the more liberties you're given by your agent, your editors, et cetera, et cetera. But did you ever feel at any time that um, that there were labels that you didn't want to be labeled with?
Um, I when the Jane Austen Book Club came out in England, they put a cover on it that was very pink and frilly, and I I just thought it was a mistake to do that. I thought what they were signaling to readers
Mhm.
was not the book that readers were going to think they were reading based on that cover. And so they, to me, they were just setting the reader up for disappointment, because the kind of reader who would read a book with that cover was not the kind of reader who would be happy reading my
Mhm.
book. And we went around and around and around on this, and to no avail from my point of view. And there were multiple reviews of the book that said, don't be fooled by the cover. This is not the book that that the cover suggests it's going to be. But it sold so tremendously well with that cover that there was no persuading the editors that they had made a mistake, even though I do think that there were many people who picked the book up and thought,
Right,
2 chapters in, this is not what I thought it was going to be.
right, right. Oh, that's amazing. I
So
wonder.
chick lit, that's the only label I bristled at, the idea that I chick lit.
Right, and a particularly kind of soppy pink chiclet as well.
Yes,
That makes it
yes,
very
not
nice.
even good chick lit, ordinary chick lit.
Oh, that's funny. But we've actually jumped ahead of ourselves. So we got to short stories, science fiction short stories. And so your first book was actually a collection of short stories, which I think begins this whole pattern when I was looking at your career. This amazing pattern that I see, that with every single book, you're breaking some kind of expectation somewhere. Um, so in 1986, your first book was Artificial Things, published by Spectra. And that was a collection of short stories. And I don't know if you know, but I give publishing classes, and I have a lot of short story writers who come to me and say, how do I get my anthology published? And the honest answer is, most often the best way to publish the short stories is to sell a novel, and then as a novelist you get your chance to do your. But you did it the other way around. So can you tell us how that happened? Was it agented, first of all?
Well, only after it sold did I get an agent. And it happened in a very peculiar way. And you have to, I'm going to ask you to believe that I had a level of naivete that is hard to fathom. But, I came to writing through that public writing workshop. I didn't take classes. I didn't pay a lot of attention to the world of New York and publishing, and I truly was terribly ignorant about how things all worked. So what happened is that I sold, those initial science fiction short stories, and one of the magazine editors who bought 2 of them called me up one day, and she said that she was moving from the magazine to 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 Spectra, to Bantam Spectra. And she just wondered, she knew a lot of writers, had a novel sitting in a drawer somewhere. I'm sorry, that's my dog uh, believing something outside should not be happening, but is. Anyway, she asked, do you, I would really be interested in seeing a novel if you have one. And again, I was so ignorant that I didn't understand that this was an unusual thing to happen. I sort of thought, oh, this is the way New York works. Editors call you up and ask you for your work. And so I was flattered, but I wasn't floored. And I said, basically, no, I don't. I don't have a novel in a drawer, very flattered that you called, but no. And she said, well, would you like to write one? And I said, honestly, no. I feel I've just barely begun to understand how short stories work. No, I don't think I'm ready to write a novel, but thank you for calling. And she was so stunned that I think I interested her far more by saying no than I would have by saying yes. And it just made her absolutely determined that I would write her a novel. And so she was attending a conference in Sacramento, and she said, let's have lunch and talk about it more. So I thought, sure, lunch sounds good. And at the end of the lunch, she said, look, how many short stories do you have? And I said, I've got probably 12 or 13. And she said, if I published your short stories, would you write a novel for me? And I said, yes. So I feel in retrospect that we both sort of lived up to the letter of that agreement and not to the spirit of it, that she brought out my collection of short stories just as she'd promised. As far as I could tell, it was in print for about 3 minutes. And I wrote Sarah Canary for her. And again, just astonishingly ignorant when I look back at it. It did not cross my mind that since she was an editor at a science fiction house, what she wanted was a science fiction novel. She did not want a novel that could maybe be read as science fiction and maybe be read as historical fiction and maybe be read as literary fiction. She was not interested in that at all. So in the end, she rejected the novel that I wrote for her, which went on to be rejected 23 more times before somebody finally published it.
And published it to great acclaim as well, right?
It did quite well, yeah. I mean, not like I was on the bestseller list, but given that nobody knew who I was, and that my editor, and this goes back to some earlier questions you had, the editor I had was at a very literary mainstream house, and she did not want the fact that I had published science fiction to be public at all. She went to great lengths to hide the fact that I was in fact a published writer, because the places I was published was Isaac Asimov's magazine and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And it was very straightforward in her head that she wanted me to have a review in the New York Times. And if it was science fiction, the science fiction, was like 4 books on a single page. And if it wasn't science fiction, then you got a whole page to yourself. And that's what she wanted from me. She wanted a New York Times review with a whole page to myself. And I could not get that if people thought I was a science fiction writer.
So how did you feel about that? How did you respond to that?
I trusted her judgment. I thought we were shooting for the moon to think that there might be a that there might be a New York Times review at all. But I was happy to leave these matters in her hands. I'd already proved that I had no idea what I was doing when it came to
was she right? Did you get a full page review?
I did get a full page review. I will say it was not a great review. And the woman who wrote it is kind of local here. And I often wonder if she remembers as vividly as I remember that she did not write a great review for my book.
I know. That's funny, isn't it? It's so true that, you get in a career, you accumulate, if you're lucky, all these good reviews, and it's got bad reviews, and you know who wrote it, you know when they wrote it.
Yeah, you can quote lines from it.
Oh, that's so funny. There was something that you said that I wanted to circle back on, and that kind of dropped out of my head right now. So before we move on, though, Sarah Canary. Oh yes, I know what I wanted to ask you. So you were saying how you don't think in terms of genres yourself when you're writing, and that you didn't recognize that your editor wouldn't want this kind of hybrid novel that could sit anywhere. When you wrote it, did you think of it as, oh, I would like this hybrid novel that can sit anywhere? Or were you just writing this? Did it just kind of come out that way because it was that way? Or how much planning went into what you
Well,
were producing
certainly
here?
nothing in my head. I made no decisions based on how I thought the book would sell or where it would be in the
Oh,
bookstore or anything, or even who the readership might be. What I
right.
wanted was thematic, that the sort of underlying connective theme of Sarah Canary is that what we see has a lot more to do with who we are than what we are actually looking at. That our expectations um, manage our perceptions, and so I wanted a book that would do exactly that same thing. Just as you said, I wanted a book that if you picked it up and you thought, oh, I'm reading a science fiction novel, that's what you would read. But if you picked it up and you thought, I'm reading a literary novel, that's what you would
Hmm.
read. I thought
Hmm.
it would be swell if the book demonstrated the same point that the
Hmm.
characters were always demonstrating. So that was my thought process, not, but then when it got those 23 rejections, that is something that came up in the letters over and over and over again was we wouldn't know how to market this book. We wouldn't know what shelf in the bookstore it would go on.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so, I made again a amateur error of thinking that something that was unusual, that would be a selling point and
Right.
not, in fact, a problem.
I have to say though that with the benefit of hindsight, now that you've safely had a great career, I love your amateur errors.
Thank you.
They're just it's so nice to have these surprises. So far I read four of your novels so far, and I've found a surprise in every one. So I really enjoy that. So it's very interesting to me that early on this was your theme. That of kind of challenging expectations. It certainly worked with me.
Well,
I
thank
also was
you.
very curious on a very small, I'm taking way too long, so I'm going to zoom here, but on a small matter of craft, or actually not even craft, the genesis of the book, you use those little newspaper clippings that are so interesting. Now, did those newspaper clippings come first and give you the kind of idea for the book, or did you, once you were writing the book, think, oh, it'd be really neat to have these little snippets that tie us back into what really was happening?
I this is an interesting question, I think, in terms of some things I said earlier about workshops, which is um, partly that one of the things I like about historical fiction is to be surprised. I think that if I say to you, I'm setting a book in Victorian England, that just those words, you have some images in your head about what a book in Victorian England might look like or might do. Um, and so if the book does those things, to me, there's nothing very interesting there. It did it showed you the things you already knew. It showed you the things that are already in the collective imagination and that everybody already knows. So I'm always looking for the thing that's not in that collective imagination, the thing that will surprise you. And
Hmm.
I think that although, it is incontrovertible that the period that we actually live in is completely insane in so many ways, um, that is true of every period, I assume, and that often history sort of takes the weirdness out and gives you something more believable, more palatable than what actually happened. So I used to say, you know, I write historical novels the way they would be written if the National Enquirer were the main research tool I was using. So
Mhm.
I wanted those sections in just to sort of show you what else was going on in the world at that time and what um, you know, some of the weirder things that were happening that
Mhm.
sort of make a space for my own, the story I was making up to be
Mhm.
kind of weird because it was going to be no weirder than these actual bits of history. And
Right.
several people in the workshop, because I was reading it aloud to them as I was writing them, really disliked those sections. And they said to me, you know, I just get into the story and then you pull me out because you want to lecture me about how the ferry system worked in 1873 in the San Juan Islands. And because I kept doing them, because I am a very obstinate person, and because those sections are actually my favorite part of the book, um, you know, my writing workshop just got more and more dispirited, and they would say, well, you know, clearly you are not going to listen to me, but I do just feel the need to repeat that I think this is a mistake. Um,
That's well, I agree. I love those little sections, but you know, I'm a complete history nerd anyway, so you're preaching to the converted. So have a step back. We were talking about your collection of short stories, and you didn't have an agent until it had been sold. But so at what point did you actually get an agent, and how and why, if you'd already sold that first book?
well, I thought it would probably be a lot easier to get an agent if I had a sale in hand, if all I was asking them to do was look over the contract, and that proved to be the case. That, you know, when I could write somebody and say, this book has been sold, this is the editor, here's the contract, I'm looking for someone to advise me on it.
Hmm.
For which in those days you got 10%. I think it's more commonly 15% now, but that was a long time ago. So that's how I got the agent. But then when Sarah Canary did not sell, a book about which he was tremendously enthusiastic. He loved it. I, I do not uh, complain in any way about his representation. I think he tried everything he could try to get someone to buy this book, but he failed. And he just called me up one day and he said that he was quitting being an
Hmm.
agent, that publishing had proved to be a cold, cruel world, and he was going to go to law school where people would be nice to him.
Or people with nice and not often said about lawyers. But and so how did your agent career go then? Did you get another agent on the
Yeah,
back
so
of
then I
that?
had to get another agent with a book that had already been rejected so many times in so many places. So not nearly as easy as showing up with a contract in hand.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, it took me 2 or 3 years, I think, to get another agent. I've
Right.
always thought, you know, if I was a real writer, I would have been writing another novel during that period of painful rejection, but I didn't. I thought, well, that was a waste of time. I won't be tricked into writing another novel. Um,
So how did you get your agent then? Who was it? Was that Wendy at that point?
that was Wendy, yeah. I was just a friend who taught in Rochester, New York, invited me to come out and work with her class for a little bit. And I met another writer there named Thomas Gavin, and he had just done an event with Wendy, and he said, "I just think the two of you would click. I really think you should send the book to her." And I've always felt the thing that she did for me that I um, am the most grateful for is not that she sold the book, although she did, and she sold it quite quickly. But that she loved it so much, even though it had been rejected so many places. I sent it to her, and she called me 2 days later, and she said I could not put it down. So she just returned to me some faith in my own book that, had been very hard to hold on to as it got rejected more and more and
Mhm.
more
Mhm.
places. So just
Mhm.
learning how much she liked it was enormous for me.
Mhm. Mhm. And so sh- and so that propelled then you going back to the novel, 1996, A Sweetheart Season. Another
Yes.
one that is sometimes seen as historical, sometimes seen as fantasy. And then kind of quite different in 2004, the Jane Austen Book Club. Is that book to this day your biggest commercial success?
It's hard to say at this point. Sarah Canary, as we said, did well for a book by somebody no one had ever heard of. It exceeded expectations, which is basically what you want in New York. You don't want to come in under, you want to come in over. But then the Sweetheart Season did less well. And my third novel was actually Sister Noon, which,
Oh.
although it was shortlisted for the Penn Faulkner Award, it sold almost nothing. And so I was on this steady downhill uh, treadmill. And then the Jane Austen Book Club, shot me back up.
Mhm.
Um, but and then I followed that with Wits End, which it was probably in terms of sales, but in terms of reviews, the least successful book I have ever written. I was used to bad sales. I was not really used to bad reviews, and I got quite a few of them for Wits End. And
Mhm.
then I wrote We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, and that is maybe I've maybe sold more of that book if you take international sales into account than
Mhm.
I did with Jane Austen Book Club.
Mhm.
Jane Austen Book Club sold really, really well in England and in America, but not so much in the rest of the world. We Are All
Right.
Completely Beside Ourselves sold in a lot more places.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. I noticed that We Are Completely Beside Ourselves was dedicated to the memory of Wendy Wheel. So at that point, she had passed away. Um, and
She, again, she was so enthusiastic about this novel, and she sold it, but prior to it coming out, she died. So she died in
mhm,
the middle of that process, very
mhm,
unexpectedly, very tragically.
I'm sorry to hear
And
that.
so then I had to try to get another agent to come in and take over when the money had already changed hands, so I had very
Right.
little to
Yeah, I
offer
was going
this.
to ask about that, whether Wendy's agency, I don't know who she was with or if she was by herself, actually, gave you someone who to step into her shoes, or whether you had to go looking. You had to go looking.
No, she left things in a mess. Everybody was quite startled, and the agent I have now said, that a lot of agencies have really taken to heart the mess that Wendy left and put in place clear plans of succession. Um,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
No, she had two young women working for her, and she had told them both that they would inherit the agency when and if she died, which she did not expect to do. Uh, and she had done nothing to actually make that happen at the point of her death. So they believed they were getting the agency, but it went to her husband instead. Who
Hmm.
nobody liked. he was a terrible husband.
Oh no.
And
Sounds like
yeah,
there's a
and
book in there.
probably. But the time I made with Ruth Ozeki, the writer Ruth Ozeki, and she said she thought her agent would be good for me, and
Mhm.
so that's what happened.
So both agents then, apart from your first one, were through personal referrals.
Yes.
Taking a step back to we are all completely beside ourselves. I have to ask, where did this book come from? Did it come from Lucy, the chimpanzee Lucy, who was raised in kind of similar circumstances?
Well, the very first uh, impulse was around an experiment in the 1930s with a psychologist named Winthrop Kellogg. And if you read the book, all of this is supposed to be stuff no going into the book. So I am major spoilering here, but he did this experiment where he tried to home raise an infant chimpanzee alongside his infant son, and to make the sort of the enrichment for both of them in their upbringing and
Hmm.
their homes as identical as possible, to see what if they were raised identically, which is not really possible, but as close as they could come, what the difference in their capabilities would be. If you immersed a chimpanzee in English, the way a child in America grows up with English spoken all around them, what kind of language facility would that chimp then have?
Hmm.
So it was that experiment that I was focused on when I
Hmm.
started, but there are a startling number of home-raised chimps, particularly through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the
Hmm.
60s.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I did my best to read about all of them.
Right. Well, why I asked about Lucy in particular was that Lucy was part of a American Sign Language experiment, teaching,
Yes,
the great
most of
apes.
these chimps were
Right.
part of language studies, and I think Lucy is a particularly tragic one, but probably the most famous
Right.
one is Washoe.
Right.
Um,
Yes, Washoe as well. Did you come across Coco? Not a chimp, but the gorilla?
yeah, of course I did. Yes, and Coco lived quite close to me.
Right. I used to work for Penny as one of her research assistants at the
Oh,
Gorilla
really?
Foundation. Yeah, so Coco used to call me Red because I wore red pants the first time she met me. And for the rest of the time, I was still red, even though I was very careful never to wear red again. So yeah, so it was another one of those moments where I was reading your book and because your book starts in the middle and actually tells you right at the end of the prologue that you're about to start in the middle. First of all, I found that such an interesting um, structure, like such an interesting way of starting your reader off. So, where did that come from? How did you get that idea of, oh, well, you know what, I'm going to start them in the middle and actually make the beginning and end a mystery?
I again, I had agenda in this book, and it was basically um, that I'm less interested in the things that make us different from other animals and more interested in the things we all share. So I started at that point of kinship, particularly with these home-raised chimpanzees. And because the person telling the story is a child who was raised with one of these chimpanzees, and who felt about her just that she was just a sister, that she was a member of the family, that she was a sister. One of the very first things I knew about the book is that I did not want the reader to know initially that the sister she was talking about was a chimpanzee, because you would just read it differently than if you thought you were reading about two sisters. And so, the very first thing I knew about the book was that I wanted to delay that revelation for a while. And in order to delay it, I couldn't start at the beginning. I could only start after the chimp had left her life. And that it would also have to be a first person narrator, because this substantial fact was going to be concealed. It had to be something that the narrator did for a reason.
You've talked this evening about being naive about a lot of things, about coming into your books just with this theme in mind or with a message that you wanted to get across. But your choice of narrator is often very interesting to me, I think. And also, and I'm not very it's not, a lot of times it's not the, once again, it's not the narrator that you expect. So don't give me any spoilers, because I haven't finished the Jane Austen book club yet, but I remember the delight on one of the very first pages where you count off and you have this beautiful sentence, where is it, that says, these were the six of us, the book club was these six members and only these six members, and yet you had gone and described every single member from a third person point of view, and all of a sudden your reader is left with, whoa, wait, the narrator's one of those people. And it was really fun. But how did you think of doing that? Like, now where did that come from?
I was reading the work of a incredible writer that almost no one has ever heard of, named Carol M. Schwiller. And she wrote a handful of fairly short novels, but a lot of short stories, which were also published as science fiction, although they're just, all they are really is weird, more than they are technically science fiction. And I had read a story by her that has that first person plural narrative. We do this, we do that. And it just looked like fun. I thought, I'll try that. That looks like fun.
I might.
But it is the question I get asked the very most about the book. Who is the narrator? So I can tell you, it's not, it's not like at the end it's revealed in a startling way. But it just really, you have to think of the collective of the book club as a character in and of itself, that the six of them create a seventh character, and that is who is telling the story, the collective.
The collective club.
Yeah.
Because I had also pulled out moments where there are clues that the narrator isn't a particular person, in addition to not being named. This is very, very interesting. And the other thing that I love about this book is that it's very funny. And the other books that I have read are not that funny. Like, did you know that you could write funny? My sister, by the way, writes funny. Like, she's also a writer, but I can't. So I'm really intrigued in this idea of, oh, I'm going to write a funny book. Like, how does that work?
Well, Jane Austen is funny, so you can't possibly write a book about Jane Austen and not wish to be funny yourself. But I would say that I think that there are very funny parts in all my books. And particularly in a book like We're All Completely Beside Ourselves, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm going to ask you to look at some things and think about some things that exist in our world that are very painful. At least they're very painful for me to think about. And that I realized many years ago that I am willing to be made only so unhappy in a fiction book. If a book is nonfiction, then there's nothing to be done. Horrible things happen. I can't expect to not be asked to look at them. But if I'm in a book that somebody is just making up, then I think that, you know, there's a limit to the sort of tragedy I'm willing to take on. And so if I'm writing a book where I know there's going to be a fair bit of tragedy, I try to reward the reader with bits that I think are very, very funny as well, so that there will be moments of light.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think that I just really enjoyed that the layering of, I mean, not just the sentences. You have some sentences that are just so funny in and of themselves. The observations are so wry, and it's so sneaky. Like some of the humor is so sly. But I also like the fact that there is also humor in the way that the book is built. You know, the fact that it's a little homage back to uh, like a modern Jane Austen, as an homage back to Jane Austen, because this is a Jane Austen book club. Like all that kind of layering was really enjoyable too. But
Thank you.
in the interest of time, I do want to mention your last book, or most current book, which was actually the book that I read first, Booth. And the reason why I read it first was because this one is sold as historical fiction, and I'm a historical fiction reader. I was like, oh, I'll start there. Um, and I thought, so my big surprise in this book was that you have written this fabulous novel about the family of John Wilkes Booth without really writing about John Wilkes Booth, right? It's like he's no bigger a character than the rest of this incredible family. And I found that an amazing surprise. But how did you get into this, and why did you first start reading yourself about the Booth family, and then why did you want to bring them to life?
I came in a very circuitous way to the Booth family. I started with a short story that I wrote that called Standing Room Only. It takes place on the day of the Lincoln assassination, and the main character in it is Anna Surratt. Anna Surratt is the 16-year-old daughter of Mary Surratt, who will eventually be hanged as part of the conspiracy to kill Lincoln. So the sort of heart of the book to me is that you see this young girl going about what will be the last ordinary day of her life, all unaware. But what is actually going on in the book is that I had read some time travel novels. I will mention no names, but I had gotten annoyed that it seemed to me that time travel, that the difficulties of passing as an ordinary citizen when you have come from 200 years in the future were being smoothed over, that I did not think it would be so easy to go without being noticed. And I live in Santa Cruz. It's a tourist town. I think I can spot the tourists. So if I can spot someone from Kansas, then I think I can spot someone from 200 years in the future. That's where I started. And so the short story takes place, I went from thinking of time travel as a sort of tourism to thinking there would be destination vacations, that tours would go to various events. And one of them, it seemed to me, might be the Lincoln assassination. So I wrote this story in which Washington, D.C. is just awash in time travelers. All these people have come. And as I was researching that story, I came across a contemporaneous account of the night that Edwin Booth returned to the stage after his little brother killed Abraham Lincoln. And it was a riveting and very moving account. It was in the New York Times. And so I wrote a second story about that called Booth's Ghost. And in the process of writing that, I came across another incident in which the father in the Booth family, Junius Booth, organized a funeral for a lot of passenger pigeons, bought a gravesite in a human cemetery, and held a service for passenger pigeons. And so I wrote another short story about that. And by then, I had just been reading about the Booth family for a couple of years, and I was hooked. And I also thought that I initially was resistant to the idea because I thought that John Wilkes had just gotten too much attention over the years, that, I don't think that he deserved my attention along with everybody else. So I sort of set out again, the mission for this book was to prove that people who don't murder presidents can be just as interesting as people who do. And I don't think that John Wilkes Booth is the most interesting person in his family. I wouldn't even put him in the top 3.
Oh, no, I agree with you, having read your book. Yeah. And so so this is my little selfish question for myself. As a historical fiction writer, you said right at the end, I believe in your author's note at the end of Booth, that you kind of go to the trouble of explaining, you know, how close to the historical record your different characters are, and that you in fact had to largely invent the eldest sister.
Yes.
That raised a question for me as to why you felt, seeing as the book has novel stamped on its front cover, why you felt like you had to explain that, and where you think the line is. Like, if it's fiction, if it's a novel, but it's got a historical setting, like, where do you feel? I once heard Hilary Mantel say that historical fiction has to first be historical and all the facts have to check out. But it's a very, very high bar, and it's a very restrictive bar. So where do you personally feel, like, how far can you go, do you feel, as a writer? Where does his history stop and fiction take over, and where is that line permissible for you?
I think there are no rules. And, I've read historical novels where the emphasis is on history, and I've read historical novels where the emphasis is on novel. And it seems to me all things are acceptable. I read a novel when I was writing Booth. I read a novel another writer had written about Asia Booth, the younger sister, in which, nothing in it is real. And I guess so much so that I wouldn't call it historical fiction, but I'm sure that's how it was marketed. And I've got no objection to it. But I do
Mhm.
I feel that readers pick up historical fiction, believe that it is, that, as Hilary Mantel said, that what they are going to see is going to be factual to the extent that it can be known or can be documented. And so I felt that it's just a very ordinary question to wonder which parts the writer made up and which parts the writer did not make up, and that I had no objection to trying to settle that question for people. But I don't feel, that there are rules or that there's a hard and fast line.
Right.
And I had something else I was going to say, but I've kind of forgotten it at the moment. It will come back to me.
Okay. Well, when it does, please let us know. In the meantime, I'm going to let everybody else ask their questions too. So Q&A time, everyone. So put up your hand if you have a question, and I will go in order. Anybody? I have done such a thorough job asking. Oh, Carol, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I see Caitlin has her hands up too, but I'll just go real quick here. I just wondered, do you think it would be as easy to, I think you said you sold your first collection of short stories before you found an agent, or is that, or did I mishear that?
No, that's correct.
So do you think it would be as easy to sell directly to a publisher these days as it was back then? I guess if we're talking the big publishers versus a very small publisher.
I think it can happen. I don't think it's common, and I don't think it was common when I did it either. I think, I happened to have caught the eye of an editor who was putting together her own list and, just starting out, and so was actively looking for work. And this is advice I hear about agents as well, that if you go to a big agency, you shouldn't submit your book to the person whose name is on the agency, that you should try to find an agent who is closer to the beginning of their career and more actively interested in finding people to put on their list.
Thanks.
Okay. So Caitlin's next, and I'm actually going to excuse myself as well. So let me just unpin you, Carol, and I'll unpin me, and then I'll add Caitlin. Where did Caitlin go? There you are. Okay, Caitlin.
Hey, Karen, I just want to say, this two-part, because I'm really fangirling right now. So I have this, and
Oh,
I
wow.
actually bought from a book dealer a signed copy because I love it so much. And I really didn't start writing until a few years ago in my 50s, and I write horror, fantasy, sci-fi, literary fiction, historical fiction. I have an agent who's trying to sell my novel, which the literary fiction people say it's too speculative. The speculative fiction people say the language is too literary. When I submit I've had about 14 short stories published in different journals. When I send my bio in, if I'm sending it to a literary fiction editor, I leave out the fact that I'm a member of the Horror Writers Association. When I send a short story to the spec, it's a completely different bio. I don't put in any of my literary fiction journals. And I just hate this. And I feel like a writer without a country. And I'm so thankful for you and what you do, because you are exactly the kind of writer that that I admire and that I want to be for myself. And I guess my question is, what do you do? I guess you just, because the publishing industry just doesn't see, it has these lines of demarcation, which to me are just so it's just false. Like, why does it have to? Okay, why does it have to be that way? That's my question for you. There you go. I get you with an easy one.
Well, this is sadly true, that what is best for you and what is best for your agent and what is best for your publisher, they don't necessarily line up neatly. That I think it's best for you to be expansive and joyful and adventurous, and to write the things that appeal to you, whatever they are, all over the map, as I have done. But what is best for your agent is that you become a brand, a recognizable brand, and that the people who have read one of your books, when they pick up the next book, will not be surprised by the fact that you are now doing something different. So it's just, in my case, I just found it a tricky place to start. But my editor said to me at one point, eventually it won't matter. Eventually it'll just be a Karen Joy Fowler novel. And that's all anybody will need to know. But, you know, it will take some time before we get to that point. I don't think I really planned it this way, but as my career has worked out, because good science fiction is so hard to actually write. Bad science fiction, very easy. Good science fiction, very hard. I have never really been able to sustain it over a novel. So what I have is a career where I write science fiction and fantasy short stories, and I write literary mainstream novels. I know people, you know, who publish under two names, that you have the name that you publish your horror fiction under, and then you have the name that you publish your literary fiction under. And I know people who not only have two names, but they have two agents. But I think it's, I don't know, I had hoped things had gotten better. And I'm sort of hearing from you that they have not, so that's unfortunate. But you know, I love my career. I love my trajectory. I love being the kind of writer who feels that I can write whatever I want, you know, whatever interests me at the moment. And so I can't help but want that for all of you as well, because it seems to me that's best. And I think I'm easily bored. So if I'm writing in the same place over and over again, I think that would very quickly cease to interest me. So I can't be more helpful than that, except just to say that I don't think readers care the way the publishing industry cares. I think that readers are more willing to step into other worlds than publishers give them credit for. I remember Samuel R. Delany saying to me once, so you've written a mystery novel and all the characters in it are gay. And you think to yourself, I have written a novel that will appeal to people who like mystery novels, and I have written a novel that will appeal to people who like stories about gay people. And so expanded my audience. Now I have these two groups, but your publisher looks at it and says, you have written a book that will only interest people who like gay literature and people who like murder mysteries. So you have cut your audience, you know, to this Venn diagram subset. And so writers and publishers just don't understand each other at all.
Well, thank you. Okay, Julie, just get you up here.
Hello,
Yes, Julie.
everyone. All right, I'm from Australia currently, from California
wow.
originally. So good morning.
Good morning.
I really enjoyed reading Booth. I didn't expect to, just because I wasn't sure if they were going to highlight John Wilkes or not. But can I get, I guess, your perspective on, I guess, the historical extremism in politics, I guess, within that family, and I guess how it perpetuates today. And even in Australia here, we're experiencing the same disparate views, like there's no moderation. Was that your inspiration originally to write these or not?
When I first began the book, I was thinking mostly about gun violence in the US. And so, as I said, I'd already been thinking about the Booth family for over a couple of years. And so when I thought about guns and I thought about America, I thought about the most famous man with a gun in all of America. And I started thinking about the families of the shooters, that that I cannot imagine anything worse than sending your child off to school and that child never coming home again. But there is a special particular tragedy in sending your child off to school and your child killing a number of people. So I wondered about the Booth family. I wondered if when I went and looked at it, would I think they were complicit in any way? What happened to them as a result of all of those questions? And I was working on that book. I think this is all in my author's note afterwards, when Trump was elected. And that honestly shocked me to my core. I truly did not expect him to win the 2016 election. I certainly didn't expect him to be competing again in 2024. And I put the book down. I just thought that, this is no longer particularly relevant to the moment that we're living in. And my agent told me that she had 7 clients call up and say they were not going to finish the books that they had started, that there no longer seemed to be a point to them. And so it took me a while to actually notice that I was writing about the moment, the particular moment, because the line from the Civil War is just so clear to the factions that we have now and the partisanship we have now. And so many people have referenced, not since the Civil War have we been so divided. Not since the Civil War has our form of government been so tenuous. So I was able to pick the book back up again once I started thinking more along those lines. But yeah, I
Yeah.
have gotten angry letters from people, emails from people who like the book and then get to my author's note and realize that they don't like me at all.
It's a shame. Anyway, Australia's watching America. I still get to vote. Thank
Everybody's
goodness.
watching America. We are actually while we've been sitting here, the interview with
Yeah,
Kamala
yeah,
and Tim Walz has been
yeah,
playing.
yeah.
I'm recording it. I will go look when we're
Yes.
done. And
I wish everybody luck. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. I think we might need some. Frances.
Yeah, my question is related to workshops, and you mentioned that even your own trusted group, there are some that didn't like certain parts of the writing and would have, just threw it away. It was up to them. And so I'm wondering, like, what is your process? And one thing that I want to say, for a long time, I've been interested in writing workshops and like using them as your own MFA. And so our paths have crossed because I started a writers group that stayed together for 10 years in Sands Hall, facilitated it. And you came after you wrote Sarah Canary and talked to our group and facilitated our writers group. So you did a fabulous job. And
Well, thank you. I wish I remembered. I'm so old, but Sands is fabulous. You couldn't have been in better hands.
so what's your process in terms of like knowing what to take and not to take, or maybe tell us about when you did take the advice and you regretted it. I don't know.
I just, my own approach, and the one I recommend is just to be very cautious about taking advice. I think that often I did that very first workshop I did in Napa Valley when I was still a poet, Galway Canal came, and we were looking at a poem and everybody sort of pointed at the same problem. Everybody had the same issue with this poem. And so we talked about it for a bit, and eventually it came around to Galway. And he said, it is just so hard to tell the difference between a mistake that the writer should not make and an ambition that the writer is just not quite yet able to realize. And that, you know, it would be a real disservice for a workshop to discourage someone from attempting to realize an ambition just because they hadn't done it yet, just because it wasn't working yet. And so I carried that with me for a long time, that, you know, not to be quick to assume that a mistake has been made, and to try to honor to the extent I can figure it out, the intent of the writer, to, you know, to offer a critique that responds to what I think the writer is trying to do, and not to complain because the writer is not doing what I would be doing with that same material, which I think is a dangerous tendency in workshops. And so the clearer you are about what you want, the easier it is to know what advice is helping you get closer to what you want and what advice is about some other story entirely. And, you know, possibly a great story, but not the one that you are writing. It's very difficult at first because so often you don't really know what you are trying to do or what you want. But I honestly, this just always, when I say it, it sounds so Californian, but I've learned to pay a lot of attention to my bodily response, so that, you know, I might get some advice that I think sounds very, very good. And I think I'm going to go home and do that. And when I pull up my manuscript and I try to make the change, I just have no energy for it. I just don't. I'm not excited to do it. I'm not enjoying doing it. And I've just learned to take that response seriously and to think, okay, it sounded like good advice. Apparently it's not. Some part of me knows this is not what I'm trying to do. This is not going to help me write the story that I'm trying to write. And then I have to figure out why, because it sounded like good advice. Why don't I want to take it? And I think that I recognize good advice in the same way, that if I'm sitting at my computer and I'm happy making these changes and fiddling with my manuscript in this way, then it was good advice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. Anna. Oh, I think you're on mute, Anna.
Okay. The idea with writing groups, I've been in a writing group there's six of us, 6 women. And what I find that I like about a writing group, and maybe you found this too, is when you get comments that are really intuitive and you don't really know if you've gotten what you wanted to say out there. And then other people might say, they might get it, you know, and I'm always like, oh, good, that really did come through, or it didn't. But the questions that come up, I find are fascinating when I think I've done one thing and then I get a response. Do you find that too, that the questions sometimes lead you in different directions?
Yes, I think, and it's not just the questions about my work, but the
Yeah.
questions that we discuss about everybody's work. I think, but as I said, I feel very cautious about the advice that you get and about workshopping. And I have seen workshops that have damaged writers. So that's something to be very careful of. But as a social activity, I love everything about it. Nobody else in your life is interested in your point of view problems. And suddenly you're in this group where everybody is interested in your point of view problems. And yeah, I love reading the work of other people. I love thinking about what I think is working and what I think isn't working and what I think they're trying to do. But yeah, so a lot of it is just the discussion around writing issues
Yeah.
that can be very valuable for me. And I've also noticed something that there might be 3 pieces that come in, and in every one of them, I think the main character is not really coming to life on the page somehow. And if I think that on one person's manuscript and then another person's manuscript and then another person's manuscript, then that is just a message from my unconscious that I have done the same thing, that I am really attuned to this problem because this is my problem.
Yeah. Mm. And one other quick question, what writers are you reading right now?
Well, I'm in an odd place right now. I am reading the Australian writer, Leanne Moriarty's new book because I'm going to be interviewing her
Oh,
in
good.
Palo Alto in a little bit. But at the same time, I am a book that I have never read and that I am not finding easygoing at all.
Oh, really?
So I am alternating between Moriarty's, rollicking, propulsive plot and the struggle of reading.
It's quite a contrast.
Quite a contrast. And I reward myself if I think you read 2 chapters of Ulysses, and I'm going to let you read 2 chapters of the Moriarty book.
And then discuss them with maybe discuss with other people.
Yes.
Group. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna. Teresa, I think you have the last question of the night. So there you go.
Oh boy, that's pressure. Thank you so much for being here. When I got the email that you were going to be the guest, I think I squealed out loud because I so loved, we are all completely beside ourselves. And I had no idea that the sister was a chimpanzee until I was totally there and shocked and amazed by the love in that book, that cross-species love, which you ask us to kind of, try to erase anyway, I just thought it was amazing. So if I can articulate my question, you talked about knowing at some point what your mission is, like with Booth not wanting to have too much light on John Wilkes Booth. But I find that like in kind of picking up on Caitlin's and trying to sell a book, like I feel like there's a difference between being a writer. Okay, here's my story, and it's unfolded in really weird ways, and I've gone places I had no idea I was going to go, and it kind of took a life of its own. And then I'm asked almost to be the critic to describe my book and do the whole synopsis and know what it is that I've actually done, even though I don't really know what I've done, sort of thing. So sometimes, like I had a friend who was a writer, and she said, the writer's job is just to write the book, let the critics talk about it, and yet I feel like I have to know so much about it. So do you actually know your mission starting out, or does it become more clear to you as you go?
The answer would be different on different books. There are books that I have known, from the moment I have the idea what I want the book to do. I don't know how, it's not the same as knowing what will happen in the book or how the book will end or having the book plotted in any way or even knowing the characters. It's more chaotic than that. I have some sort of clarity for some books. For other books, I have the experience that I think, Lily, that Doctorow describes, where you're driving a car at night and the headlights are on and you can see only as far ahead as the headlights illuminate. And that, that of course works as long as you keep seeing as far ahead as the headlights illuminate. I am trying to write a book now where that experience is not happening to me. Ever hopeful. So yes, sometimes I know what I'm doing and often I do not. I used to always get asked if I outlined my books before I wrote. And I always used to say, no, I don't. I have never outlined a book before I wrote, but I realized later that that's just sort of half an answer because I do outline my books. I outline them after I've written them in order to try to see what I have and maybe what gaps need to be filled in, or that I've spent a great deal of time on an issue that is not really very critical and too many pages spent doing this or that. So I do outline, but when I was in college, if you had to turn in the outline with the paper, I always wrote the paper and then I wrote the outline, and apparently that's the way I still work.
Thank you, Teresa. And I'll just pop back on for a second. So Karen, we're at time, and I want to thank you so much for actually taking this time on an evening when you could have been spending it with hopefully the future president and vice president of the United States.
Hopefully she's waited for me.